In the previous video, we compared Israel's civil laws in Exodus and Deuteronomy with those of their neighbors in Mesopotamia. Now, how would we extrapolate ethics from those laws, considering that they were addressed to a specific culture in a specific place? For example, people were supposed to bring their sacrifices and their tithes and so on to the place that the Lord your God will choose, which turned out to be Jerusalem. Well, what do you do if you don't live in Israel? What do you do if you don't live in an agrarian culture where capital is defined differently in our culture, often in terms of education and so on? How do we understand and apply God's law today, especially keeping in mind that God originally gave these laws to an ancient Near Eastern people addressing a very different legal milieu than ours? The categories of what laws had to address, well, Israel's laws addressed those kind of laws that were addressed in the ancient Near East. Some of them we see improvements above those cultures, and some of them we see it's roughly the same as was in those cultures. But does it take us to all of God's perfect ideal? The law of the Lord is perfect, the psalmist says. It was perfect in terms of God speaking to them within their cultural milieu, with what they were ready for, with what would be intelligible to them, but not always God's ideal purpose transculturally. Civil laws in any society are concessions to human sinfulness. In no society do civil laws represent the ideal of virtue. It might be great if everybody wanted to stop at the stop sign, but the only thing that the law is going to actually punish you for is if you don't stop at the stop sign. And maybe it won't be the law if you get in an accident. Maybe you'll get punished another way. But anyway, there's simply a minimum standard to enable society to function, to work together. God's standard is actually higher than what civil law can address. So we have to be careful trying to extrapolate ethics from law. Many things God was serious about are addressed. Many other things that God was serious about aren't addressed yet. God's morality is higher than the law. That's why Israel's civil law said, "You shall not kill." But Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:21 says, "You've heard it said, you shall not kill. I say to you," 5:22, "you shall not want to kill." Israel's law said, "You shall not commit adultery." Jesus in Matthew 5:27 says, yeah, the law says you shall not commit adultery. I say to you, you shall not want to commit adultery. So when the law says you shall not covet, yeah, take that for all the other things. You shall not steal. You shall not even want to steal. And Jesus, I think, uses that as a way of getting a hold of what the law is really inviting from us. Pharisees also talked about building a fence around the law to make sure you don't accidentally violate the purpose of the law's intention. And Jesus really takes that home to the heart even further. Although the Pharisees also, they talked about kavanah, the intention of the heart. Jesus really drives that home. If we ignore the genre, the literary type or the rhetorical type, the way we should interpret them, we ignore the law's genre, we're going to misunderstand God's character, and we're going to misunderstand the proper function, the intention behind these laws. So the picture in the previous slide, I think maybe some of my students sometimes would have liked to wrung my neck, but I think most of my students love me. Anyway, to give examples of laws that are less than God's ideal, for example, look at indentured servants. Now, when we speak of indentured servants in the history of the U.S., indentured servants were supposed to be set free after a certain amount of time. That's based on the law of Moses, where indentured servants serve for 7 years. They're set free. They're to be given land. They're to be given a new start for themselves to, go ahead and make their own living instead of just, paying back their debts or whatever with you. Well, in the case of Israelite slaves, that's the kind of slavery we're talking about. But they weren't treated like free people. So Exodus 21, somebody beats their male or female slave with a rod, and the slave dies as a direct result. The beater must be punished, but not if the slave gets up after a day or two. Well, that was the same as for free people in the same context. If, they get up after a day or two, well, then they weren't as badly hurt as you might have thought. But in this case, some translations say it's because the slave is the person's property. Well, literally, it's the person's money saying, this slave was paid for. So it's a way of telling the slaveholder, it's a deterrent to the slaveholder by saying, it's going to be your economic loss. So don't beat him like that. And of course, if they lose a tooth or an eye, you have to set them free. So that's also an economic loss. But this was addressing the slaveholder. It wasn't addressing the slave. And from the slave's perspective, yeah, if I die, that doesn't help me. Anything that the slaveholder lost their investment on me. So we have a different perspective in the New Testament. For example, when Paul in Ephesians 6:5-9 says, slaves, obey your masters. Oh, slaveholders loved to quote that verse to their slaves in the U.S. South. What they didn't like to quote was verse 9. And you, masters, do the same things to them, because you have a master in heaven yourself, and he's no respecter of persons. So you're just the same in his sight as the slave is. Now, I could go into a lot more detail on that, but that's a whole other session, and I have a whole series of videos in Ephesians. But was slavery ever God's ideal? Well, I would say, based on that and some other passages in the New Testament, no. And that the abolitionists correctly understood it. There's a reason why abolitionism, there's a reason why slavery died out in the late Roman Empire. And yeah, economics had something to do with it, but given how much Rome was a slave society, I think there's also more than that. The influence of Christian teaching. And the abolitionist movement in Britain arose as a direct result of Christian teaching. And actually, a lot of the Islamic world argued against it because they said, no, this violates Islam. Well, I think the Quran actually raised the standard on protecting slaves more than the surrounding culture did. So I didn't want to directly say it's the Quran's fault. It was part of the culture, like Exodus. They put some restraints on it, but Muhammad held slaves, which is something that Jesus certainly did not. He came to serve, in fact, he says, Mark 10:45, and Paul did not. So they were addressing a slave culture, but they were moving things in a different direction. And so those who caught that trajectory became abolitionists. And I read a lot of the 1800s literature on both sides of the slavery debate before the Civil War. And I think that the abolitionists were the ones with the really good biblical hermeneutic, taking into account, okay, here was the culture, but here's God's ideal. Here's where it's moving beyond the culture. Like, for example, the penalty for kidnapping was death. Leroy Sunderland says this in his anti-slavery manual and also in his book, Testimony of God Against Slavery. The penalty for kidnapping was death. Kidnapping was used for slave trading. The penalty for slave trading should be death. Therefore, I won't even go with the therefore, but you can see there were a number of people who were bringing out the implications of this stuff is serious. Sexual abuse of slaves was punished, but not as badly as if she were free. And again, we say that That's below God's standard. God's standard, his ideal, is we're all equal in his sight. That doesn't mean we can't have different roles. I mean, I still need to listen to my dean, but happily my dean is also my brother in Christ and he listens to me. But again, that's another story. Other concessions. Polygamy, male polygamy with wives, never worked out well in the Old Testament, but the law regulated rather than prohibited it. So it says, okay, you're not allowed to marry a woman and her sister. And maybe looking back at how that worked out for Jacob. Kings aren't allowed to multiply wives. Well, see how that worked for Solomon later on. Another sin tolerated in the Old Testament was divorce. How do we know it wasn't God's ideal? Jesus said God tolerated it in Moses' day simply because people's hearts were hard. The ideal from the beginning, he says, is shown in the creation story. One husband and one wife become one flesh. And of course, especially Jesus is quoting it from the Greek version. And in Greek culture, you weren't allowed to have more than one wife, although people had concubines and stuff on the side. But Jesus is ratcheting it up. One husband, one wife, one flesh. And any breaking of that is less than God's ideal. Now, also the New Testament gives us kinds of exceptions that point us towards the ways we need to apply that. But noticing how Jesus handles the Torah also shows us that God is very serious about the intention, the purpose. So God regulated divorce, God regulated polygamy, but ultimately neither one was God's ideal, because God's ideal was Adam and Eve before the fall. Holy war may also be in this category. So I'm going to give you reasons why it made sense in the culture in which it happened, but also clearly it's not what God calls us to do today. So the idea was if entire societies could be depraved beyond hope, God might execute corporate capital punishment through judgments like he did on Sodom. And whether we like it or not, and chances are most of us don't, we can't believe in a sovereign God and deny judgment because, look, we're all going to die if the Lord doesn't come back first. And usually so far he hasn't. I say usually, never so far has he. So all of human life stands under the sentence of death. God could do this through Israel as well as he could do it any other way. So corporate capital punishment wasn't allowed to be executed on Canaan until it became corrupt enough for such an invasion. So Genesis 15:16, until the iniquity of the Amorite is complete. There are some limitations that would preclude it today. It was only in the land. It was only under God's orders. You do have a case of just war to free slaves in Genesis 14. So there are cases of just war in the Old Testament. Whether that's allowed or prohibited under the New Testament is a matter debated among theologians that I won't try to get into here because that would be a big rabbit trail from just dealing with the Old Testament part of this. But in terms of holy war, it was a culturally understood practice, devoting people and things to deities. Now, part of the motivation behind this was Canaanites would entice Israel to sin. We have some evidence, although it's disputed. So again, I won't try to weigh in on this except to say that some people have argued that there was cultic prostitution at some of these places. Child sacrifice, thousands of urns from Carthage, where a number of Canaanites migrated, Phoenicians migrated. These urns with the remains of cremated babies. Periodic revolts of Canaan against Egypt, like every year in the spring, they'd revolt again, and Egypt would put them down and have to come in, and then they'd revolt again the next year. Well, only total war would stop this. And it's illustrated by what happened. Israel didn't drive them out, and eventually they did lead to Israel sinning and Israel facing judgment, as well as the Canaanites. But was this ever God's ideal? Was this the best way to deal with things? Well, in the New Testament, we see a very different way. A war against Satan's kingdom, casting out demons, rather than killing the people the demons were working through, and so forth. Jesus tells us God's ideal. You heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. It also talks about turning the other cheek, although that was more of an issue of shame in that culture, where somebody would strike you on the back of the cheek, and normally that was an insult, a challenge, like you may see in some movies about a certain Mediterranean culture, and those who adopted it, slap you on the cheek with a glove. That's a challenge to a duel or something like that. Well, it was an insult, and you were allowed to hit him back, or they could be charged a monetary fine. But Jesus says, turn the other cheek. Don't bother defending your honor. God has your back, and presumably your cheek as well. In fact, God proved it by how he loved us when we were his enemies. Romans 5:8. But God demonstrates his love for us in this. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. For if, verse 10, when we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? And I could tell you a story about that, but I'll have to save that for Matthew videos. We do have Matthew videos, by the way, on my YouTube channel. So how do we understand the laws in their culture? We won't cover all this in this one video, but we'll start into it. Culture determined the legal issues to be addressed. Civil laws are meant to limit sin, not to abolish it. Only Christ in the heart can abolish sin, and that's proved by Israel's history. Islamic Sharia cleans up society in terms of Islamic law, but doesn't change hearts, and we could give examples of that. And I think Christian Reconstructionism, those who try to impose Israel's civil laws on other societies, which they can't do completely anyway, because some of the things were only for in the land and so forth, I think that misinterprets the law. We have to go through the lens of how Jesus invites us to interpret the law. For example, Matthew 9:13 and 12:7. If you'd understood what this means, I desire mercy more than sacrifice, you wouldn't have committed these things. But the laws at least limited sin. They were good. They were an improvement. Often, but not always, they did so more than surrounding cultures. For example, granting refuge to escaped slaves, and the fact that there were no class divisions among free persons. Capital sentences certainly tell us some of the issues that God was quite serious about. Death sentence for murder, sorcery, idolatry, blasphemy, and then sexual offenses: adultery, premarital sex, same-sex intercourse, bestial intercourse, drunken rebellion against parents, kidnapping, which is used for slave trading. But this doesn't mean that God wasn't serious about anything else. So these things in the Torah, these were things God was serious about. Also the Sabbath and some other things. Among the civil and ritual laws, there are some moral absolutes, even as stated. The Ten Commandments, various other principles based on God's ways. Be kind to foreigners in the land, as you were foreigners in Egypt. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then he goes on to say, and don't seek vengeance. Ethical principles behind the mere limitations of sin. God seeking to inculcate character in us Don't muzzle the threshing ox that's working for you. Don't take a mother bird with her young. She can maybe bear more young. Give Sabbath rest to your animals, and so forth. Now, there's continuity and discontinuity between what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament. And sometimes people teach entire Bible interpretation courses focused on this principle. Well, what we can say is Jesus raised the standard from the Old Testament to God's higher ideal, but he regarded the Old Testament as God's word. He drew principles from the Old Testament and argued against his opponent's interpretations by citing other texts, which is also what the other teachers of the law did with each other. They would say, okay, well, you got that text, but what about this text? Is a way of interpreting that text in the right way. Jesus appeals to the way God created things originally, the way they were meant to be in Genesis. So we need to take that into account, and where principles like mercy more than sacrifice, taken from Hosea 6, and other principles from the prophets, help us to understand better the purpose of the Torah, and seeing how Jesus and Paul interpret it are places where we're going to go in more detail in the next video. But first, some areas of continuity. Look for eternal principles, even though they're expressed in cultural forms, just like Jesus did. Find God's heart in the law, revealed in places like Exodus 33 and 34, where God is so disappointed with his people and he's ready to judge them. But God reveals himself as a God gracious and compassionate, full of covenant love and covenant faithfulness, who visits the iniquity of the parents and the children to the third and fourth generation, but his gracious love is to the 1,000th generation of those who fear him and keep his commandments. And by the way, you can switch which category you're in. If you're in the wrong category, you can always switch to the other one. You're welcome to do it. But find God's heart. We see the Spirit was active already in the Old Testament in some rather dramatic ways. 1 Samuel 19, the Spirit, as the prophets are prophesying, the Spirit falls on the assembly so heavily that when somebody comes to kill David, they fall down and start prophesying, not because they're so godly, but because the presence of God is so strong in that place. 1 Chronicles 25, where they're praising and worshiping God, prophesying in their worship. So a lot of the Psalms come out of that context. So we see the work of the Spirit was already there in the Old Testament. How much more should we expect that in the New Testament, where he says, all your sons and daughters will prophesy? Again, Joel talked about that for the future. Acts talks about it already being the case. So, yeah, let's pray for more of that sensitivity of the Spirit today as well. But don't just pick and choose what suits you. Like the person says, I'm so religious. I take a Sabbath on Thursday to honor the atheists, and on Friday to honor Muslims, and on Saturday to honor Jews and Adventists, and on Sunday to honor a lot of the rest of the Christians. And yeah, I take a Sabbath 6 days a week. I'm so religious. And don't say, in the Old Testament, adultery was a sin. Aren't you glad we're not under the law? That's missing the point. It's still a sin. Salvation has always been by grace through faith and always expressed by obedience. So Exodus chapter 20, before he gives the 10 Commandments, he prefaces it by unmerited redemption. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of slavery. God chose Israel, he says in Deuteronomy, only because of love. He says in a little bit later, a couple chapters later in Deuteronomy 9, not because of their righteousness. God's covenant faithfulness is expressed in obedience. And that's our response to his covenant faithfulness. We express our faithfulness by obedience. And God's longing for obedience is for our good, he says in Deuteronomy. We obey because we have been redeemed and brought into a covenant relationship with God, and we want to obey him. And if we don't want to obey him, well, one way to obey him is to learn to want to obey him, to let God actually change our hearts. So how far do we go with discontinuity? Was Jesus against the Sabbath, for example, or merely against its abuse? I mean, it was one of the Ten Commandments. The New Testament says relatively little about the Sabbath, except where Jesus was disagreeing with how people were implementing it. But does he revoke the Old Testament principle? The Sabbath itself was around before the law. It was already there in creation. God built the Sabbath into creation by resting on the seventh day. And I won't go into, well, I don't take them as 7 literal days, just so you know. I take them as, well, that's a whole other subject. I won't digress into that. But just to say, on the 7th of the 7 days of Genesis, God rested, and that was something apparently not just for Israel, but for everybody, even though he gives Israel specific rules regarding the Sabbath. So how far do we go with discontinuity? Some have insisted it's replaced on Sunday. That was enforced by Constantine, and you do have the idea already in the early church fathers, but this is going to depend partly on whether you're part of a church that says, okay, we accept early church traditions beyond the New Testament, or you say, no, at the end of the New Testament, that's it. If you say beyond the New Testament, it's it, well, then you can't say Sunday's the Sabbath. That comes later. Constantine was really a dramatic political coup, though, because the sun worshippers and the Christians were all happy about it. But for the Christians, it wasn't because it was the day of the sun. Christians were happy about it because the first day of the week was when Jesus rose from the dead. But that was especially within the sphere of the Roman Empire and its mission. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church long honored the Sabbath is Saturday, and Sunday is the Lord's Day, the day of the resurrection. So thinking about that, at least I think we need the principle, at the very least. I have my own opinion on more details, but at the very least, we need to say, okay, the way God built the world to work, the way God built our bodies to work, we need a day off work every week. And I take one, and I don't take the other days off. We can go into more detail on some of these, but I'll save that for the next session.